15 years ago, he was the bravest man in Ramadi. Today, he couldn't even enter a restaurant without his hands shaking. The sound of his prosthetic echoed like gunshots in the tense silence. Every glance was a bullet, every whisper an explosion. And somewhere in that elegant dining room sat someone who would change everything, someone who knew exactly who Jake Morrison really was. Jake Morrison stood frozen at the entrance of Bella Vista, the finest Italian restaurant in Cedar Falls. The polished marble floors reflected the golden light from crystal chandeliers, creating an atmosphere that screamed, "You don't belong here." His hands sweated inside the borrowed suit, the same one he'd worn to his father's funeral 5 years ago, the only elegant clothing he owned. The phantom pain pulsed through his right leg, like it always did when he was nervous. 15 years after the explosion, and his leg still ached as if it were there. The doctors called it phantom limb syndrome. Jake called it a daily reminder of his failures. "I can't do this," he thought, unconsciously touching the point where the prosthetic connected to his thigh. The titanium and carbon fiber device had cost the VA $43,000. Jake would have preferred to keep the money and learn to use crutches. His phone buzzed. Text from Sarah. "Jake, if you don't walk through that door right now, I'm personally going to drag you inside. Emma is on her way. Don't disappoint me." He sighed deeply, his breath fogging slightly in the cool evening air. Sarah had been planning this blind date for 3 weeks, and he'd already cancelled twice. This time she'd threatened to show up at his apartment with his niece and nephew if he didn't go. Jake adored Emma and Giuseppe, but he couldn't bear to see them looking at him with that mixture of pity and confusion that children have when they don't understand why Uncle Jake is different. "For Sarah," he murmured to himself, and pushed through the glass door. The sound of his prosthetic on the marble echoed through the entrance like a drum announcing his arrival. Clack, clack, clack. Each step was an involuntary declaration that he wasn't like the others. Conversations dimmed in volume. Eyes turned discreetly in his direction. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that could sell magazines, looked up from her reservation book. Her professional smile faltered when she saw Jake. Her eyes quickly scanned his appearance, the cheap suit that hung slightly too loose, the 5 o'clock shadow he'd forgotten to shave, the way he favored his left leg. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" Her voice carried that forced politeness that service workers use when they want you to leave. "Morrison, table for 2 at 8. Melissa Torres checked her list, frowning slightly. She'd been working at Bella Vista for 2 years, saving money for her acting career that seemed to get further away each month. She prided herself on being able to read people, and this man didn't fit the usual clientele. "Ah, yes. Morrison." She hesitated, glancing around the elegant dining room. "Are you sure this is the right place, sir? Perhaps you're looking for the Olive Garden. It's just a few blocks down." Jake felt heat rise up his neck, the familiar burn of humiliation that had become as constant as his phantom pain. "This is the right place. Of course, of course." Melissa grabbed 2 menus, her smile becoming even more strained. "Please follow me." She led him through the main dining room, past tables occupied by well-dressed couples and groups of executives. Jake could feel the stares following his awkward progress. A woman in pearls and a designer dress whispered something to her husband, who looked in Jake's direction and shook his head with obvious disapproval. "Poor man," the woman murmured, loud enough for Jake to hear. "What a shame." Melissa guided him to a table in the darkest corner of the restaurant, far from the windows and away from the view of other customers. The table was small, clearly meant for less important guests. "Here's perfect for you," she said, placing the menus on the table with a slight flourish. "Your server will be Roberto." Jake sat heavily, relieved to take the weight off his prosthetic. The chair creaked slightly under his weight. He'd gained 30 pounds since he'd stopped exercising regularly. Not that it mattered. Who would care about the appearance of a 38-year-old night janitor? The restaurant was busy for a Tuesday evening. To his right, a group of executives discussed a multi-million-dollar deal, their voices carrying the confidence of people who'd never known real struggle. To his left, a young couple celebrated an engagement, the woman admiring a ring that probably cost more than Jake's annual salary. What am I doing here? His mind wandered, as it always did when he was uncomfortable. The elegant surroundings faded away, replaced by the dusty, broken landscape of his memories. Suddenly he wasn't in Bella Vista anymore. He was back in Ramadi, March 15th, 2011. The day that changed everything. The school was too quiet. Jake and his unit had received reports of insurgent activity in the building, but when they arrived, they found only empty classrooms and overturned desks. Dust danced in the rays of sunlight streaming through broken windows. "Something's not right," murmured Marcus O'Brien, his best friend and roommate. Marcus was from Boston, son of an Irish family of cops. He had the same sharp instinct that Jake had for dangerous situations. "Agreed," Jake replied, checking his explosive detection equipment. "Place is too clean." That's when they heard it. A low crying, almost inaudible, coming from the basement. Jake and Marcus exchanged glances. Civilians. They descended the stairs carefully, weapons ready. What they found left them speechless. 30 people, men, women, children, crammed into a space that could barely fit 10. Entire families who had hidden there when the fighting started 3 days earlier. "Please," said an elderly man in broken English, "don't hurt us. We have children." Jake immediately lowered his weapon. "We're not going to hurt you. We're Americans. We're here to help." That's when his detector started beeping. Explosives. The entire building was rigged. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, looking at the readout. "Jake, this whole place is a bomb." Jake's blood ran cold as he studied the detector. 6 separate devices, strategically placed throughout the building. Enough explosives to turn the entire school into rubble. "We need to get these people out of here," Jake said, his mind racing. "Now." "But how?" "If we all leave together, we'll draw attention. And if the insurgents are watching, then we do it one at a time," Jake decided. "I'll take the children first. You organize the adults." "Jake, man, that's going to take forever. And if the bombs... They won't detonate yet. They're waiting for something, probably our entire unit." Jake knelt in front of a 6-year-old girl with enormous, frightened eyes. She was clutching a dirty rag doll to her chest. "What's your name?" he asked in Arabic. "Amira," she whispered. "Amira. That's a beautiful name. Do you want to get out of here? I can take you somewhere safe." She nodded, extending her small arms toward him. Jake picked her up, feeling how light she was, how fragile, like his own niece, Emma, back home. "I'm going to come back for all of you," he promised the others, "one at a time, but I'm going to get everyone." And he kept his promise. "Sir, sir!" Jake blinked, returning to the present. Roberto, a middle-aged waiter with a slight Italian accent, was standing beside his table with a concerned expression. "Sorry, I was thinking." "No problem, sir. Would you like something to drink while you wait?" Jake looked around. Several people at nearby tables were staring at him with curiosity. How long had he been gone? "Water, please." "Of course. And perhaps our appetizer menu. We have some options that are more accessible." The implication was clear. Roberto had assumed that Jake couldn't afford the restaurant's food. Jake felt the familiar burning of humiliation in his chest. "Just water for now." Roberto nodded and walked away. Jake checked his phone. 8:15. Emma was 15 minutes late. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe Sarah had told her about his condition, and Emma had decided she didn't want to get involved with a problematic veteran. It wouldn't be the first time. Jennifer had done exactly that in 2013. They'd been engaged for 6 months, when Jake had his first severe PTSD episode in front of her. He'd woken up screaming in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking violently. Jennifer had tried to calm him, but Jake was back in Ramadi, fighting enemies only he could see. She'd broken off the engagement the following week. "I can't handle this, Jake. You need professional help, and I can't be your therapist." He'd never sought professional help. Soldiers don't cry. Soldiers don't break. At least that's what his father had always said. Robert Morrison had been a Vietnam veteran himself, a man who'd come home from war and buried his trauma so deep that it only emerged in violent nightmares and empty beer bottles. He'd taught Jake that real men handle their problems alone, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. "You think you got problems, boy," his father would say during his darker moments. "Try watching your best friend step on a landmine. Try coming home to a country that spits on you. You kids today, you don't know what real war is." Jake had enlisted partly to prove his father wrong. partly to escape the suffocating atmosphere of their small Iowa town. He'd wanted to be the kind of soldier his father could be proud of. Instead, he'd become exactly what his father had always feared, a broken veteran carrying invisible wounds. Roberto returned with the water, placing it carefully on the table. "Has your companion arrived?" "Not yet." "Well, I'm sure she'll show up soon." Roberto hesitated. "Sir, I don't want to be intrusive, but perhaps you'd prefer our simpler menu. We have some options that are more suitable for different budgets." Jake looked at Roberto. The man was trying to be kind, but the message was clear. "You can't afford to be here." "I can pay for the food," Jake said calmly. Of course, I didn't mean to imply. It's just that—" "Just what?" Roberto looked around uncomfortably. "Nothing, sir, I apologize." But Jake knew what Roberto was thinking, the same thing everyone was thinking. What kind of man shows up at a fine restaurant wearing a cheap suit and limping with an obvious prosthetic? What kind of woman would agree to meet someone like that? At the table next to him, Richard Blackstone, CEO of a tech startup, whispered loud enough for Jake to hear, "This type of people should have a separate entrance. He's making the other customers uncomfortable." His companion, a blonde woman with expensive jewelry, laughed softly. "Maybe he's lost. Or maybe it's some kind of charity case." Jake felt his hands begin to tremble. The familiar wave of anger and humiliation rose through his chest. He wanted to stand up, walk over to their table, and explain exactly who he was. He wanted to tell them about Ramadi, about the 27 people he'd saved, about the medal that was stored in a drawer in his apartment because he couldn't bear to look at it. But he did nothing. He just drank his water and tried to become invisible. His phone buzzed again. "Emma. Sorry for the delay. Emergency at the hospital. Arriving in 10 minutes. Are you okay?" Jake typed back, "I'm here." 10 minutes. He could handle 10 more minutes. The restaurant continued to buzz around him. Conversations about stock options and vacation homes, about children's private schools and country club memberships. A world that Jake had never been part of, even before the war. His father had been a mechanic, his mother an elementary school teacher. They'd lived paycheck to paycheck in a modest house on the wrong side of Cedar Falls. Jake had joined the army partly for the college benefits, partly to see the world beyond Iowa's cornfields. He'd had dreams of using his GI Bill to study engineering, maybe starting his own business. Those dreams had died in a basement in Ramadi, buried under the weight of survivor's guilt and phantom pain. Now he worked the night shift as a janitor at an office complex, cleaning the desks of people who made more in a month than he made in a year. It was honest work, but it wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself. For 47 minutes, Jake Morrison carried people out of that building. Children first, then elderly, then adults. One at a time, through a route he'd memorized, avoiding the windows where snipers might be watching. Each trip was a calculated risk. The insurgents could detonate the bombs at any moment. Snipers could pick him off as he crossed the courtyard. But Jake kept going, driven by a determination that surprised even him. "Why are you doing this?" asked Fatima, a young mother whose husband had been killed in the fighting. She was holding her infant son, tears streaming down her face. "Because it's the right thing to do," Jake replied simply. Marcus stayed behind, organizing the people, keeping them calm. "It's going to be okay," he would say. "Jake's going to get us all out of here." On the 27th trip, Jake was exhausted. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, but he continued. Only 4 people remained. Marcus, an elderly man, a young woman, and Amira. "Take the old man first," Marcus said. "Then the woman. Me and the girl will go last." "No," Jake said. "You go now, I'll take the girl." "Jake, that's an order, soldier." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He'd known Jake since basic training, had seen him make impossible decisions under pressure. If Jake said he had a plan, Marcus trusted him. "See you on the other side, brother." They were the last words they exchanged. Jake watched Marcus disappear into the courtyard, then turned to Amira. The little girl was crying softly, overwhelmed by the chaos and fear around her. "Hey, sweetheart," Jake said gently, kneeling down to her level. "Remember what I told you? We're going to get you out of here." "I'm scared," she whispered in Arabic. "I know, but I'm going to protect you, okay? Just like your daddy would." Jake picked her up, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck. She was so light, so trusting. For a moment he thought of his sister Sarah, of the children she wanted to have someday. He thought of his own future children, the family he hoped to build when he got home. They were halfway to the exit when the first explosion hit. "Excuse me, are you Jake Morrison?" Jake looked up, startled. A woman was standing beside his table, Latina, about 35, with kind but tired eyes. She wore dark jeans and a simple blue blouse, the clothes of someone who'd rushed out of work. "Emma? I'm so sorry I'm late. We had an emergency at the hospital and—" She stopped, noticing his expression. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake stood awkwardly, his prosthetic making its characteristic sound against the marble floor. "No, I'm fine. It's just, this place is a bit intense." Emma looked around, noticing the curious stares from other tables. "Ah, I understand." She sat down, and Jake did the same. "Sarah told me you don't like crowds much." "Sarah talks too much," Emma smiled. "She worries about you. She talks about you all the time. Good things, I hope. Always." Emma picked up the menu. "So Sarah told me you work in security." Jake hesitated. Technically, he was a night janitor at an office complex, but security sounded better, and it wasn't entirely untrue. He did have keys to the building. Something like that. "Must be interesting. I work in the ICU at Veterans Hospital. I see a lot of people who've been through difficult situations." There was something in the way she said it that made Jake look at her more carefully. Emma wasn't just making small talk. She knew. Sarah had told her about his military service. "Sarah told you about me?" It wasn't a question. Emma nodded. "She said you served in Iraq, that it was difficult." Jake felt the familiar tension in his chest. "And you still came?" "Why wouldn't I? Most people, when they find out about—" He gestured vaguely toward his leg. "About the fact that you served your country, about having sacrificed for others." Emma leaned forward. "Jake, I work with veterans every day. I know what you've been through. I know what you've sacrificed. Why would that make me want to stay away?" Jake didn't know what to say. He was used to pity, to discomfort, to people quickly changing the subject. He wasn't used to acceptance. Emma Rodriguez had her own reasons for understanding. Her ex-husband, Miguel, had been a Marine who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He'd come home with invisible wounds that eventually consumed him. 2 years after his discharge, Miguel had taken his own life in their garage while Emma was at work. She'd found him when she came home that evening, still wearing his dress blues. The note he'd left was simple. "I'm sorry. I can't fight anymore." Emma had spent the last 5 years working with veterans at the hospital, trying to understand what she could have done differently, how she could have saved the man she'd loved. Sarah had told her about Jake's struggles, and something in his story had resonated with her own pain. Roberto appeared again. "Good evening, ma'am. Can I offer you something to drink?" "Red wine, please. And can we see the full menu?" Roberto hesitated, glancing at Jake. "Of course. But perhaps I should mention that our main courses are a bit expensive." Emma frowned. "Excuse me. I just want to make sure you're aware of the prices before—" "Before what?" Emma's voice had cooled considerably. Roberto realized he'd made a mistake. "Nothing, ma'am. I apologize. I'll get the wine." When he walked away, Emma looked at Jake. "Does that happen often?" "What?" "People assuming you can't afford things." Jake shrugged. "Sometimes." "That's unacceptable." "I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't be." Emma reached across the table and took his hand. "Jake, look at me." He reluctantly raised his eyes. "You are not less than anyone in this room. Do you understand that?" Jake wanted to believe her, but it was hard when he spent every day being treated like a second-class citizen, when his own reflection in the mirror reminded him of his failures. Across the restaurant, the main door opened. A man of about 60 entered, greeting staff members by name. He had well-groomed grey hair and wore a well-tailored Italian suit. Clearly, he was someone important. "Who's that?" Emma asked. "I don't know. Probably the owner." Antonio "Tony" Rossetti made his usual nightly rounds, checking tables, chatting with regular customers. It was something he'd done every night for 15 years, a tradition he'd learned from his father. A restaurant is more than food, Salvatore had always said. It's about making people feel at home. Tony had built Bella Vista from nothing, starting with a small pizzeria that barely kept the lights on. Through hard work, determination, and a little luck, he'd transformed it into one of the finest dining establishments in Cedar Falls. But success hadn't changed his fundamental belief that every customer deserved respect and dignity. Tony stopped at Richard Blackstone's table, as he always did. Richard was a regular customer, though not particularly pleasant company. "How is everything tonight, Mr. Blackstone?" "Fine, Tony, fine. Though I have to say, you should be more careful about the type of clientele you allow in here." Richard gestured discreetly toward Jake. "That man over there is clearly out of place. He's making the other customers uncomfortable." Tony followed Richard's gaze and saw Jake for the first time. A man of about 40, clearly uncomfortable, sitting with an attractive woman who seemed to be trying to make him feel better. "What's wrong with him?" Tony asked. "Look at him, Tony. The cheap suit, the way he walks, and it's obvious he doesn't belong in an establishment like this. Probably some kind of charity case." Tony looked more carefully. That's when he noticed it. The way the man favored one leg. The way he sat, as if he were relieved to take weight off something. The military posture, even when relaxed. And then Tony saw the tattoo. It was small, almost hidden by the shirt sleeve, but Tony recognized it immediately. The emblem of the 3rd Infantry Battalion. The same unit his son David had talked about countless times. Tony felt his heart race. He knew that unit, he knew their stories, and if this man had served there... "Excuse me," Tony said abruptly to Richard, leaving him mid-sentence. Tony walked slowly across the restaurant, his eyes fixed on the man in the corner table. The closer he got, the more details he noticed. The slightly trembling hands. The way the man's eyes constantly swept the environment, always alert. The way he positioned himself with his back to the wall. All signs that Tony recognized. Signs he'd seen in his own son when David came home on leave. Antonio Rossetti had served 15 years in the army himself, from 1980 to 1995. He'd been deployed to Panama and the Gulf War, but had never seen real combat. He'd spent most of his service in logistics, making sure supplies got where they needed to go. It was important work, but it wasn't the kind of service that earned medals or recognition. Tony had always carried a quiet shame about his military service. While other veterans told stories of heroism and brotherhood forged in battle, Tony's stories were about inventory management and supply chains. He'd done his job well, but he'd never been tested the way some soldiers were tested. When his son David enlisted, Tony had been proud but terrified. Proud that his boy wanted to serve, terrified that David might face the kind of combat that Tony had been fortunate enough to avoid. David was now a lieutenant in Afghanistan, and every phone call home was a relief. When Tony reached the table, Jake looked up with a cautious expression. "Good evening," Tony said calmly. "I'm Antonio Rossetti, owner of this restaurant." "Jake Morrison," Jake replied, half standing. "Please stay seated." Tony looked at the tattoo again, now clearly visible. "That tattoo? 3rd Battalion." Jake instinctively pulled his sleeve down. "Yes, sir." Tony felt a chill run down his spine. "When did you serve?" 2007 to 2011. "Iraq?" "Yes, sir." Tony closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there were tears in them. "My God," he whispered. You're not Jake Morrison from Cedar Falls, are you?" Jake frowned. "I am. How do you—" "The Jake Morrison who saved those families in Ramadi." The entire restaurant seemed to have gone silent. Jake could feel every eye on him. How do you know about that?" Tony knelt beside Jake's table, not caring about his expensive suit on the restaurant floor. "My son David serves in Afghanistan now, Lieutenant David Rossetti. He told me your story. Everyone on the base knows your story." Jake shook his head. "It's not a story, it was just, I did my job." "Your job?" Tony laughed through his tears. "Jake, you saved 27 people. 27. You carried each one of them to safety, knowing the building could explode at any moment." "I didn't save everyone," Jake said quietly. "But you tried. You went back for that little girl, even knowing it was too dangerous." The secondary explosion came out of nowhere. Jake had just picked up a mirror when the floor shook violently. Debris began falling from the ceiling. "Run!" Marcus shouted from somewhere behind him. Jake ran, protecting a mirror with his body. They almost made it to the exit when the second explosion hit. Bigger, closer. Jake felt something heavy hit his back, pushing him forward. He threw a mirror through the doorway to safety, a second before a concrete beam crushed his right leg. The pain was instant and absolute. Jake screamed, trying to move, but he was trapped. Through the dust and debris, he could see a mirror outside, crying and screaming his name. "Marcus!" Jake shouted. "Marcus, are you okay?" Silence. "Marcus!" More silence. Jake tried to crawl, but the beam was too heavy. Blood flowed from his leg in a growing pool. He could feel bone fragments moving under the skin. That's when he heard them. Voices. Insurgents. They were coming. Jake grabbed his weapon, checked his ammunition. 6 bullets. If he was going to be captured, it wouldn't be alive. But then he heard helicopters. Americans. "Here!" he shouted with all the strength he could muster. "Here!" The insurgents arrived first. Jake killed 3 before his ammunition ran out. He was preparing a grenade, his last option, when the Marines arrived. They found Marcus under a pile of debris. Dead, instantly. Jake spent the next 14 months in hospitals. 17 surgeries, amputation below the knee, physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychological therapy that he refused. When he finally returned home, he discovered he'd been promoted to sergeant and recommended for the Silver Star. He refused the ceremony. He put the medal in a drawer and never looked at it again. "You saved that girl," Tony continued. "Amira. She's alive today because of you." "How do you know her name?" "David told me. The whole story. How you went back for her even knowing it was a trap. How you protected her with your own body." Jake shook his head. "Marcus died. My best friend died because I wasn't fast enough. Marcus died because you were both heroes," Tony said firmly. "He chose to stay. You chose to go back. You both saved lives." The restaurant was completely silent now. All the customers, all the staff, were listening. Tony stood and turned to face the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the space, "I want you to meet a true American hero. This is Sergeant Jake Morrison. In March 2011, he saved 27 Iraqi civilians from a booby-trapped school in Ramadi. He lost his leg saving a 6-year-old girl. His best friend died in that mission." Tony turned back to Jake. "And tonight, people in this restaurant treated him as if he were less than them." Richard Blackstone had gone pale. Melissa, the hostess, was crying. Roberto looked like he wanted to disappear. "Jake Morrison," Tony continued, "you will never pay a bill in this restaurant again, never. And anyone who treats you with less than the utmost respect is not welcome here." The room exploded in applause. People stood up, clapping. Maria Santos, the waitress who had lost her husband in Iraq, was the first to approach. "Thank you," she said through tears. "Thank you for bringing my husband home." One by one, other customers approached, apologizing, thanking, wanting to shake his hand. Jake was overwhelmed. 15 years of hiding, of feeling ashamed, of carrying guilt, all crumbling at once. Emma held his hand firmly. "Are you okay?" Jake looked at her, then at Tony, then at all the people around him. People who now saw him for what he really was. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Tony said. "You just need to accept that you're a hero, that you always have been." Jake thought about Marcus, about Amira, about all the nights he'd spent awake, wondering if he'd done enough. For the first time in 15 years, he began to believe that maybe he had. "Thank you," he whispered. Tony smiled. "Thank you, Sergeant, for your service, for your sacrifice, for reminding us what it really means to be brave." When the crowd finally dispersed and Jake and Emma were alone again, she squeezed his hand. "How do you feel?" Jake thought for a moment. "Different. Better. Like I can finally stop hiding. Good. Because you should never have to hide." Jake looked around the restaurant, the same place where he'd felt so out of place an hour before. Now it seemed different, welcoming, like he belonged there. "Emma?" "Yes? Would you like to have dinner with me? Really this time?" She smiled. "I'd love to." And for the first time in 15 years, Jake Morrison felt at home. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. Emma was easy to talk to, and her experience working with veterans meant she understood things that others couldn't. "What's the hardest part?" she asked over their main course. "The guilt," Jake said without hesitation. "Every day I wake up and think about the people I couldn't save. Marcus, the 3 civilians who died in the explosion. I keep thinking, what if I'd been faster? What if I'd made different choices? You saved 27 people, Jake. 27 families who went home because of you. But 3 didn't." Emma leaned forward. "Jake, I work in trauma medicine. I see life and death decisions every day. And I can tell you this, you can't save everyone. No one can. The fact that you saved as many as you did, that's not just heroic, it's miraculous." Jake looked at her, really looked at her. "How do you do it? How do you deal with losing patients?" "I remember the ones I save. I focus on the lives that continue because of what I do. And I accept that I'm human, not God." It was a simple truth, but one that Jake had never allowed himself to accept. Later, as they shared dessert, Tony approached their table again. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," he said, "but I wanted to give you something." He handed Jake a small, framed photograph. It showed a young man in army dress uniform, clearly Tony's son David. "He's going to be so excited to meet you," Tony said. "You're a legend to him and his unit." Jake studied the photograph. David Rossetti looked young, eager, full of the same idealism that Jake had once carried. "He looks like a good soldier." "He is, and he's alive today because of lessons learned from soldiers like you." When Tony left them alone again, Emma asked, "How does it feel, being called a hero?" Jake considered the question. "Strange. For so long I've thought of myself as a failure, as someone who let people down. And now? Now, maybe I'm starting to see myself differently." As the evening wound down, Jake realized something had fundamentally changed, not just in how others saw him, but in how he saw himself. The shame that had weighed him down for 15 years was beginning to lift. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Would you like to do this again sometime?" She smiled. "I thought you'd never ask." When they finally left the restaurant, Tony stopped them at the door. "Jake, one last thing." "Yes, sir?" "My son David comes home on leave next month. He'd love to meet you." Jake hesitated. For years he'd avoided other veterans, especially younger ones. He didn't want to be reminded of who he used to be. But now maybe it was time to stop running from the past. "I'd love to meet him too." Tony smiled. "Excellent. And Jake?" "Yes?" "Welcome home." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice. He took Emma's hand, and together they walked into the night, leaving behind 15 years of shame and finally embracing the hero he'd always been. As they walked to their cars, Emma stopped and turned to face him. "Jake, I want you to know something." "What's that?" "Tonight, watching you in there, seeing how you handled everything with such grace and humility, I've never been more impressed by anyone in my life." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just don't disappear on me, okay? I'd like to see where this goes." "I'm not going anywhere," Jake promised. And for the first time since Ramadi, Jake Morrison meant it. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself back at Bella Vista. But this time the circumstances were very different. Tony had organized a small gathering to welcome his son David home from deployment, and Jake had been invited as the guest of honor. David Rossetti was everything Jake had expected, young, enthusiastic, and full of respect for the veterans who had paved the way for his generation. But what surprised Jake was how much he enjoyed talking with the younger soldier. "Sir, I have to tell you," David said over dinner, "your story has been told in every briefing I've attended for the past 2 years. Your required reading at the War College." Jake nearly choked on his wine. "Required reading. Your actions in Ramadi are studied as a perfect example of tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. The way you assessed the situation, prioritized civilian lives, and executed a rescue plan under fire, it's textbook." Emma, who was sitting beside Jake, squeezed his hand under the table. She could see how much this meant to him. "I never thought of it that way," Jake said quietly. Well, you should, David replied. Because of what you did, new protocols were developed for civilian evacuation in urban combat zones. You literally changed how we operate. Tony raised his glass. To Jake Morrison, a true hero, who finally knows he's a hero. The small group, Tony, his wife Isabella, David, Jake and Emma, raised their glasses in a toast. Later that evening, as Jake and Emma walked through the downtown area, she asked him how he was feeling. Different, he said. Like I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be. And who is that? Jake thought for a moment. Someone who doesn't hide from his past. Someone who can help other veterans who are struggling the way I was. What do you mean? I've been thinking maybe it's time I started talking to other vets, sharing my story, letting them know they're not alone. Emma smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. The hospital has a veteran support group that could use someone like you. Someone like me? Someone who's been through hell and found his way back. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in front of a room full of veterans at the Cedar Falls VA hospital. Some were recent returnees from Afghanistan and Iraq. Others were older, Vietnam-era veterans who had been carrying their burdens for decades. My name is Jake Morrison, he began, and for 15 years, I thought I was a failure. He told them about Ramadi, about Marcus, about Amira, about the years of shame and isolation that followed. I spent 15 years believing that I wasn't worthy of respect, of love, of a normal life. I was wrong. And if you're sitting here thinking the same thing about yourself, you're wrong too. After his talk, a young Marine approached him. She couldn't have been more than 25, but her eyes held the same haunted look that Jake recognized from his own mirror. Sergeant Morrison, she said, I lost 3 members of my squad in Helmand Province. I keep thinking, if I'd been faster, if I'd made different choices. Jake looked at her with understanding. What's your name, Marine? Corporal Sarah Chen, sir. Jake smiled. Sarah, that's my sister's name. And let me tell you something, Corporal Chen. The fact that you're here, that you're talking about it, that you're seeking help, that takes more courage than anything you did in Afghanistan. But the guilt never goes away completely. But it gets easier to carry when you realize that you did everything you could with the information you had at the time. And when you start focusing on the lives you saved instead of the ones you couldn't. As Jake drove home that evening, he thought about how much his life had changed. He was still a night janitor. He'd decided to keep the job because he actually enjoyed the quiet, solitary work. But now he also volunteered at the VA hospital twice a week, speaking to veteran support groups and helping newly returned soldiers adjust to civilian life. Emma had become a constant presence in his life. They'd moved in together 3 months ago, and Jake was beginning to think about proposing. The idea of marriage, of building a family, no longer seemed impossible. His relationship with his sister Sarah had also improved dramatically. She'd been so proud when she learned about his volunteer work that she'd cried for 20 minutes. His niece and nephew now looked at Uncle Jake with admiration instead of confusion. Most importantly, Jake had finally taken his silver star out of the drawer. It now sat on his dresser, not as a reminder of his failures, but as a symbol of his service and sacrifice. 1 year after that night at Bella Vista, Jake received a letter that would change his life once again. It was from Iraq, written in careful English. Dear Mr. Jake, my name is Amira al-Rashid. I am now 21 years old and studying medicine at Baghdad University. I do not know if you remember me, but you saved my life when I was 6 years old. I have been looking for you for many years. A journalist who was writing about the war helped me find your address. I wanted you to know that I am alive and well because of your bravery. I am going to be a doctor because I want to save lives the way you saved mine. I think about you every day and pray that Allah has blessed you with happiness and peace. I hope someday I can meet you again and thank you in person. With all my love and gratitude, Amira. Jake read the letter 3 times before the tears made it impossible to continue. Emma found him sitting at their kitchen table, holding the letter and crying. Jake, what's wrong? He handed her the letter without speaking. Emma read it, and when she finished, she was crying too. Oh my God, Jake, she's alive. She's going to be a doctor. Because of what happened that day, Jake said through his tears. Something good came from all of it. Emma sat beside him and took his hands. Jake Morrison, you are the most extraordinary man I've ever known. I want to write back to her, Jake said. I want to tell her about Marcus, about how proud he would be of her. I think that's a beautiful idea. That evening, Jake sat down to write the most important letter of his life. Dear Amira, of course I remember you. I could never forget the brave little girl who trusted me to keep her safe. Your letter means more to me than you could ever know. For 15 years I have carried guilt about that day, wondering if I did enough, if the sacrifices were worth it. Your letter answers that question. You should know that my best friend Marcus O'Brien died in that school. He stayed behind to help organize the evacuation, and he gave his life so that you and others could live. I know he would be so proud to know that you're going to be a doctor, that you're going to save lives just like he helped save yours. I would very much like to meet you someday. Until then, know that you carry with you the hopes and dreams of everyone who fought to keep you safe. With love and pride, Jake Morrison, P.S. I'm getting married next month to a wonderful woman named Emma. She works with veterans and helps them heal from their wounds. I wanted you to know that I found happiness, just as you have. 2 years later, Jake Morrison stood at the altar of a small church in Cedar Falls, waiting for Emma Rodriguez to walk down the aisle. Tony Rossetti was his best man, an honor that had surprised and touched Jake deeply. In the front row sat Sarah and her family, beaming with pride. Behind them were dozens of veterans that Jake had helped through his volunteer work at the hospital. David Rossetti was there in his dress uniform, having just returned from his second deployment. And in the third row, wearing a beautiful blue dress and crying tears of joy, sat Amira al-Rashid. She had flown from Baghdad to attend the wedding, fulfilling a promise they had made to each other in their letters. As Emma walked down the aisle, Jake thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the broken, ashamed man who had limped into Bella Vista 3 years ago, to the confident, purposeful man he had become. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Tony Rossetti stood up. I don't object, he said with a grin, but I do have something to say. Jake and Emma looked at him in surprise. 3 years ago, a hero walked into my restaurant. He didn't know he was a hero, and neither did anyone else. But sometimes all it takes is one person recognizing the truth to change everything. Tony looked directly at Jake. You changed my life, Jake Morrison. You reminded me what real courage looks like. You showed me that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear prosthetics. The congregation laughed and applauded. So I just wanted to say in front of all these people who love you that you are exactly where you belong. You are exactly who you were meant to be. And we are all better for knowing you. As Jake and Emma exchanged vows, he thought about Marcus, about the promise he had made to live a life worthy of his friend's sacrifice. He thought about Amira, about the ripple effects of one moment of courage. He thought about all the veterans he had helped and all the ones he would help in the future. But mostly he thought about the future, about the family he and Emma would build, about the children they would raise, about the love they would share. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Emma with all the passion and gratitude of a man who had found his way home. Later at the reception, Amira approached Jake during a quiet moment. Mr. Jake, she said, I have something for you. She handed him a small, wrapped package. Inside was a photograph of a new hospital in Baghdad with a sign that read, the Marcus O'Brien Memorial Children's Wing. I helped raise money for this, Amira explained. It's named after your friend, the man who helped save my life. Jake stared at the photograph, overwhelmed with emotion. Amira, this is incredible. It seemed right, she said simply. He should be remembered. As the evening wound down, Jake found himself standing outside the reception hall looking up at the stars. Emma joined him, slipping her hand into his. What are you thinking about? She asked. Everything, Jake said. How different my life is now. How much has changed. Any regrets? Jake thought about the question seriously. No, not anymore. Even the pain, even the loss. It all led me here. To you, to this life, to understanding who I really am. Emma leaned against him. And who are you, Jake Morrison? Jake smiled, feeling the weight of his prosthetic, the phantom pain that would never completely go away, the memories that would always be part of him. I'm a man who learned that sometimes the things that break us are the same things that make us whole. As they stood there together, Jake Morrison, veteran, hero, husband, and healer, finally understood that his story wasn't about what he had lost. It was about what he had found. And sometimes that makes all the difference. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't know they're heroes. Sometimes the most broken among us are actually the most whole. And sometimes all it takes is one person seeing us for who we really are to change everything. This is the story of Jake Morrison, a man who learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. A man who discovered that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past, but learning to carry it with grace. And sometimes angels do wear prosthetics.